fairy tales are layered. I think of them as palimpsestic. So, of course, they contain this incredibly vivid and wild animistic history, but they also contain layers from sort of 16th century France and 19th century Germany. And here we might see patterns that we might see as sexist or misogynist. But the thing is that every teller, when they tell a fairy tale, either if it's written or it's spoken, they accrue upon the fairy tale their own sort of ethics and values. And I think that's one of the wonderful things about fairy tales. They are common spaces. So for me, the question is not arguing with the perspective that was woven in there by the Grimms or by Charles Perrault, which has very specific gender roles, for example, but allowing us to see the wild multiplicity of all the different versions and variants and history so that we can wake them up. So for me, how you rewild fairy tales is that you look at the diversity of wonder tales. And so you do that both around the fairy tales and within the tales themselves. You wild the relationality. So Cinder is a great example. We know Cinderella from Charles Perrault, and everybody thinks of her as boring and subservient and passive and a bit weepy until her fairy godmother turns up to save the day and get her married to the prince. But on the other hand, there are thousands of Cinder children, both girls and boys, across the world. And in all of these different variants from different cultures, from different continents, they have much more agency and much more power. So in the first version that we know of that was written down in 9th century China, you have a young girl whose mother dies and she makes a kinship with a golden fish. And when the fish is killed, she tends the bones, and it's the bones that give her the wishes and give her the dress that she can come to the feast, to the ball. And what you see here is that the Cinder child, and you see this in patterns all over the world, is that she becomes much, much more active and much, much more vibrant. She has agency, and it's her tending of the bones of often her mother, ancestor, that will allow the transformation. So it's not that she does nothing at all. And of course, then that deepens the relationship to the more than human and also to the ancestors as well. So I think of Cinderella not as a story about a relationship to a prince, but as a story about a relationship to the returning spirit of your dead mother, whether she comes in plant or animal form. And that is a really important shift for these stories. And other stories do the same. Little Red Riding Hood is a great example of a tale that has become about shame and modesty and staying on the path and feeling as if it's somehow perhaps your fault for straying if you then get attacked. But according to the fairy tale scholar Jack Zipes, the oral versions are very, very different. They're actually an initiation journey of a young girl learning how to enter the wild and how to find her own way home. So that pattern is very different, and feels to me really crucial today that we begin to understand or remember these different patterns that have often been forgotten with the move from the oral to the written. And so this is my last image, and I love this phrase, letting stories breathe. It's by a socio-narratologist called Arthur Frank. Stories, they've been fixed on paper and on screen, but the key question is how to let them breathe and really wake up to remember their wild relationality.
During conflict and in oppressive governments, fairy tales were used as a way to publicly share frustration and protest and revolutionize, but through story. Can you expand on that?
I think that stories have always been a space in which we can share our outrage and in which we can talk politically in different ways. One of my storytelling teachers is an incredible woman called Shonali Kumbers. She's a Drutzilla, so she comes from an oral Jewish tradition of storytelling, and she was taught by her grandmother, and it's an incredible line. She has 4,000 stories that she was taught between the ages of 4 and 18, and she remembers these stories. So I'd really recommend looking at her work. But her grandmother, Edith Marks, said people think that stories change the world. It's not the stories that change the world, it's the conversation around the stories. And I think that is really crucial, because stories can deal with incredibly difficult, dark stuff. But traditionally, you would tell them in communities, and then there would be space for conversation around that. So community would be working through these issues together. I think one of the reasons why I'm so obsessed with fairy tales, because, we're really lucky to live in a globalized world, and the world we live in is often, for many of us, largely secularized, which means we don't have a collective shared mythology, but everybody knows the fairy tales. At least they think they do. And then it turns out that they don't really know them, but they do to a certain extent. And I think that for me, that makes fairy tales common spaces. And what we need today, 100%, is common imaginative spaces where we can collectively transform our dreaming, to reimagine kinships and to imagine ourselves outside, away from this illusion of anthropocentrism, into something deeper and more complex. For me, that's really fundamental. And I also really love the work of Tyson Yunkaporta, who's an Aboriginal scholar. And, he talks about the fact that we need to understand individual art is incredible and transformative, and we all need it. We need it to survive. But in the West, we live these very individualistic patterns. Actually, it's community that needs to think imaginatively differently. And one of the ways is to work with the common stories, because we need to change as common people.
Find out more on advire.life.